I'd like to start by thanking the Center for Constitutional Studies and for organizing this event and all of you for coming. In my talk, I'm going to be discussing the impact of voting with your feet on the history of American federalism, also often known and described as foot voting. Voting with your feet is choosing where you want to live based on the kinds of government policies that you prefer. And it's a ubiquitous element in American history. One can do that obviously in a federal system by choosing a state or a locality. That's going to be my principal focus, but it's also possible to do this in the private sector to some degree with private planned communities and also through international migration. In a very real sense, the United States as a nation is the product of foot voting in that the vast majority of Americans are either themselves immigrants like me or they're descendants of people who immigrated to the United States from other countries because they preferred the policies and institutions of the U.S. To those that they left behind. I'm going to first start off by talking a little about foot voting generally and its potential benefits. Then I'll discuss the relevance of the founding to foot voting, and in the last parts of the presentation, I'll discuss the evolution of foot voting during the 19th and 20th centuries and on into the issues involving foot voting that we face today. So foot voting, as I mentioned before, is a mode of political decision-making where people can use it to choose what sorts of government policies they want to live under. And it can be distinguished from ballot box voting, the more conventional mechanism of political choice that we tend to think of, where if we want to change in government policy, we try to vote out the bastards, throw them out, and then vote in a new set of bastards who hopefully will pursue different and better policies. So foot voting is an alternative mechanism of getting out from under policies that you don't like or going to ones that you prefer. And it has several potential important advantages. One is foot voting in a federal system can potentially satisfy a wide range of diverse preferences at once. People who prefer one set of government policies, say high taxes and high amounts of government services, can choose to settle in areas which have those policies. People who prefer the opposite can choose different places. A second is that foot voting, much more than ballot box voting, empowers the individual. In all but the very smallest of jurisdictions, the individual ballot box voter is largely powerless. He or she has only one chance in many thousands or many millions of actually casting a vote that's decisive to the outcome of an election. By contrast, with foot voting, the individual has more choice. If he or she decides to live in a particular location, that choice does make a decisive difference. It does decisively affect the policies that they get to live under. In part because of the fact that foot voting allows an individual to make a decisive choice, it also has important informational advantages. Because the chance that a ballot box vote will affect an electoral outcome or affect government policy is so extremely small, most voters are what economists call rationally ignorant. That is, it's actually rational for them to pay relatively little attention to government and public policy, and lots of survey data indicates that that's precisely what they do, that they often don't know even very basic information about what the government is doing, what the policy of different parties are, and so forth. If you're interested in this, I have an entire book about it called Democracy and Political Ignorance. By contrast, when people vote with their feet, they do actually have much better incentives to consider their options, to seek out relevant information and weigh them carefully. If you're like most people, you probably spend more time and effort seeking out information the last time you bought a car or a television set or an iPhone than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. That's not because your television set is more important than the presidency or it deals with more complicated issues. It's because you knew that the TV set that you chose is actually the one that will end up in your living room, whereas when you flip on the TV and you see the president, or you have the misfortune of seeing him or some other politicians, the chance that your vote can decisively affect who those people are is very, very small. By contrast, you have a big chance of being able to determine whether you live in Utah or some other state or what locality you live in, and therefore people tend to take those choices more seriously. Finally, studies by development economists show that foot voting is a major driver of economic growth and development. It enables people to move to areas where they can be more productive, which in turn historically accounts for a large part of the economic growth that we've experienced in the US and also around the world. So it can also make people materially better off, both by enriching the foot voters themselves and by increasing their productivity such that the entire economy grows. So I'll start off now with the overview of foot voting in the history of federalism and look first at the founding. The founding fathers, as you've already heard today, discussed and debated a great many different issues related to federalism. But interestingly, they had almost nothing to say about foot voting. If you read the Federalist Papers, the debates at the ratifying conventions and so forth, there's almost no discussion of voting with your feet. Despite this, the federal system established at the founding actually created a pretty good environment for foot voting. This is so for several reasons. Most obviously, of course, is that it is a federal system, so there are different states with different policies on various issues which offer foot voters a potential choice. A second is that the federal government created by the Constitution, at least as originally understood and interpreted, at least through the 1930s, actually put fairly tight limits on federal government power. It left a lot of issues up to the states, and therefore a lot of issues could potentially be left up to the choice of foot voters. They had some real options. Also, from the founding through the 1930s, and even by international standards, even today, states had to raise a pretty high percentage of their own revenue themselves from their own taxpayers. They couldn't rely, for the most part, on the federal government giving them money. And if they have to raise their own funds, that gives them incentive to compete for tax-paying residents and to try to adopt public policies that are attractive to them, which is also beneficial for foot voting. So a good environment for foot voting, we might say, was a kind of fortunate byproduct of the founding. It wasn't really what they were aiming for. It wasn't something they thought a lot about, but it was created anyway through the interplay of the way the federal system was set up. And if you look at the development of federalism through the 19th and early 20th centuries, foot voting plays a major role. Lance Sorensen has already discussed some aspects of westward expansion and how it impacted American federalism. Obviously, westward expansion was a major element of foot voting. Many millions of people, both from the eastern states and also immigrants from abroad, moved to new western territories. Some of this movement was just the attraction of free land and natural resources, but some of it also was the result of policies deliberately adopted by the new western states and territories to encourage foot voting. For example, states like Wyoming and Utah actually pioneered giving much greater rights to women than was the case in the eastern states. There's among the first states, the first actually to give women to vote and give them various other kinds of equal rights. They did this because, at least early on, they had a shortage of women relative to men. The men who lived in those territories said, we want to have the opportunity to get married and have children and so forth, and the only way you can do that is to make the new state attractive to women. There were also other policies that they adopted to try to attract immigrants both from abroad and also migrants from the eastern United States. The state of Utah is actually a particularly good place to discuss this because, of course, the state of Utah was initially created through an effort at deliberate mass foot voting. It was established as a refuge for the Mormons escaping the persecution that they had suffered in the eastern states. So Utah, in some ways, a particularly dramatic example of foot voting in the U.S., differing from most of the other cases, and it was a mass organized movement as opposed to a relatively uncoordinated one by individuals. Another way in which foot voting impacted 19th century American political constitutional development in the history of federalism is through the development of slavery. Obviously, slavery is the very opposite of foot voting. The whole point of keeping someone as a slave is that they're not allowed to leave without the master's permission. Despite this, of course, many slaves did try to escape, fleeing to the northern free states, and this led to the enactment of Fugitive Slave Acts, first the one in 1793, then the much more severe one in 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Acts, in the effort to enforce them, led to major conflict between free states and the federal government and between the North and the South. It definitely exacerbated sectional tensions in various ways and helped precipitate the Civil War. So in this very real sense, the effort by slaves to try to engage in the foot voting that had been unjustly forbidden to them was an important cause of the Civil War, which of course eventually led to the abolition of slavery and to the transformation of the federal system in many different ways. The Civil War was not by any means the end of African American involvement in foot voting. Obviously, in the aftermath of the Civil War, after Reconstruction, the southern states adopted Jim Crow segregation policies and other repressive measures targeting African Americans, and many African Americans responded to this by, in fact, voting with their feet for northern and western states where policies were relatively more favorable. In what might be called the First Great Migration from the 1890s to around 1920, some 1 million out of a total of about 10 million Southern blacks migrated to the North and the West. This not only greatly benefited the migrants themselves, who on the whole ended up in a better position, but it ended up significantly transforming American politics over time by creating a significant black voting population in areas and states where they were allowed to vote. From around 1940 and 1960, there was the second and even larger Great Migration of African Americans to the North, which also had a big political impact, and eventually, of course, an impact on the federal system through the ways in which it helped precipitate civil rights legislation by the federal government. This pattern of persecuted minorities trying to vote with their feet and bettering their lot in that way is not unique to African Americans, or for that matter to the Mormons in the 19th century. There are a number of other examples, not all of which I can review here, but I will mention the more recent example of gays and lesbians migrating to states and localities that were more favorable to them, which was certainly a major trend from, say, in the 50s and 60s and onwards, and helped precipitate the rise of same-sex marriage, for example, in more tolerant areas, and eventually spreading to the entire country. If you look at foot voting today, it certainly continues on a substantial scale. If you look at the patterns involved there, people tend to be moving towards areas with relatively lower housing costs, with more job opportunities and lower taxes. This is actually one of the reasons why southwestern states, including Utah, have been gaining population relative to other parts of the country. Ironically, whereas historically African Americans tended to move away from the South to the North in search of greater tolerance, in recent decades there's been somewhat of a reverse migration back to the South because the southern states, many of them have cheaper housing and more open labor markets, which is attractive to often to the poor and the lower middle class. But while foot voting, I think, has continued to create important benefits, there are significant modern obstacles to foot voting that have arisen, particularly over the last several decades. One is, of course, the growth of federal power, which increasingly occupies more issues, leaving fewer available to be subject to freedom of choice by foot voting. Another is that the states have become more dependent on federal government funding. They now get about a third of their budgets from the federal government, which to some extent diminishes their incentive to compete. It also leads to somewhat greater standardization of state policies because nearly all of these federal funds have conditions attached to them requiring the states to adopt the policies that the federal government wants. The states themselves and often localities have also imposed some significant obstacles on mobility. Probably the biggest one is restrictive zoning, where in many major cities, particularly those on the two coasts. There have zoning restrictions which make it difficult or almost impossible to build new housing. As a result, the price of housing has skyrocketed in these areas, and they've effectively locked out many millions of people who might otherwise migrate there, seek out job opportunities and housing. The effect of this, according to a recent study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, is to reduce our GDP by as much as 9%, because people end up being trapped in areas where they're less productive or even where there are few or no job opportunities. A similar effect is imposed by state licensing restrictions, where we now live in a world where some 30% of Americans have to have licenses to do their jobs, and that includes in some states even such not as exalted professions like interior decorator, florist, and even tour guide, and often the licensing restrictions are quite onerous. You have to take many months of expensive classes and the like, and that makes it harder for people to move to states where their labor is more in demand. It also, of course, raises prices for the other consumers who live in those states. So as a result, in part of zoning, licensing, and similar policies, over the last several decades, unfortunately, we have diminished interstate mobility for the poor and the lower middle class compared to earlier periods in American history. Some of this is a result actually of beneficial factors. Very few Americans today are as desperate as, say, African Americans in the Jim Crow South were 100 years ago, but some of it is the result of these pernicious policy constraints, which we would do well to try to address. So overall, foot voting has had a big impact on the development of American federalism. It has turned out to be actually one of the most beneficial aspects of the American federal system, even though not really one intended by the founders. However, in recent years, some significant problems and obstacles have arisen, and I hope we can find ways to diminish them. Thank you.